But yeah, tried our
think
best.
I was riding the wave of the recent release, I think, which makes it a bit easier, perhaps.
Mm. Did you
Thank
notice?
you, everyone who's joining us. We'll get started in just a moment. And thanks to everyone on Facebook. Feel free to say hello in the chat. We can't see your faces in the webinar format, but let us know where you're Zooming from and say hi.
Yeah, where are y'all from?
So we've got 3 countries of us panelists, I think.
Yeah.
Which is so we apologize if the internet goes crazy.
Arthur, you said you're in France right now, right?
Yes, near the Alps. You could see the mountain behind me, but now it's too dark to see.
Wow, people from all over. This is wonderful.
Got some local Seattleites.
Yeah.
Yes.
If that's the right word for people from Seattle.
Exactly.
Yes.
Oh, Poland. Awesome.
Oh, Daniel Hahn. Hi, Daniel. Yay.
Oh, hi, Daniel.
Hi, Danny.
Oxford. This is quite impressive. Very international.
We should get a map and start putting some pins in it.
Yeah.
Anyone have a map?
Okay, I think it's a good time to get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Maeda-Allman, and I'm one of the author events co-coordinators at the Elliott Bay Book Company in Seattle, Washington. And I'm so excited to see people from Seattle and all sorts of places joining us today, including our 3 panelists. So we're Zooming today from the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We encourage you to find out more and support the programs of the Lushootseed Language and Cultural Center. And I put a link and some more information here in the chat box. And I'd like to begin by saying special thanks to Takami Nieda for approaching us and for her support of literature, translated literature through her teaching, her own translating, and her reading for many years. And we'd hope that this would happen in person, but it's kind of a silver lining that she's able to appear with fellow translator Arthur Reiji Morris today. And they're going to be reading from and discussing 2 extraordinary books written about minority cultures within Japan. The protagonists are also both dealing with issues having to do with identity, prejudice, self-acceptance, and also dealing with the aftermath of sexual violence. Chesil's book written by and about a Zainichi, ethnic Korean woman born in Japan, also includes some beautiful passages set in the Northwest. Lee Kotomi's book takes us into the changing but still difficult situation of lesbian lives in Taiwan and Japan, and also engages with queer literatures in Taiwan and Japan. Fitting subject for Pride Month, which after reading this book, I don't think you're going to see in the same way. Today's moderator is Willow Heath, the co-founder and lead writer of the literature and culture site Books and Bow. They promote and celebrate literature and translation, queer writers, and indie publishers. And I believe that the other co-founder, Jess, is here with us today. So I'm briefly going to introduce our translators and the books, and then I will hand things over to Will for the rest of the program. Takami Nieda is the translator of Chesil's novel, The Color of Sky is the Shape of the Heart. A graduate of Stanford, a former bookseller, and a tenacious champion of translated literature, she is the translator of more than 10 works from Japanese into English and has received numerous grants in support of her translations, including the Penheim Translation Fund for the translation of Kazuki Kanashiro's Go. She teaches writing and translation at Seattle Central College, which is just 2 blocks away from Elliott Bay. And she's currently working on a translation of Finger Bones by Hiroki Takahashi, and also probably some other things that she may talk about later. So the book that she has translated, that she's speaking about today, The Color of the Sky is the Shape of the Heart, and here it is by Chesil, a third-generation Korean born in Japan. She attended film schools to study acting till she discovered a new passion for writing. She decided to mark the end of her 20s by writing a novel inspired by events during her childhood, and that novel became her debut book. And in 2016, she received the Gunzo New Writers Prize and was nominated for the Akutagawa Prize. In 2017, she won the Oda Sakunosuke Prize, as well as the Ministry of Education's Fine Art Award for debut work. Her second novel, Pray Human, was published in 2020, and I'm looking forward to an English translation of that book at some point. Arthur Reiji Morris is joining us. He usually lives in the UK, but he's joining us from France today. And he's the translator of Lee Kotomi's novel Solo Dance. And I have a advanced reader's copy here, but it looks basically like.
It's quite similar.
And so Arthur is a translator of Japanese literature, manga, and video games. Born in London, he graduated from the University of Leeds in 2015 before moving to Tokyo. And when he's not translating, Arthur enjoys writing music and practicing Japanese calligraphy. He returned to the UK in 2019 and is now based in London. Lee Kotomi, the author of Solo Dance, is a bilingual Japanese-Chinese writer, translator, and interpreter. She was born in Taiwan in 1989 and moved to Japan in 2013. In 2017, she won the 60th Gunzo New Writers Prize for Excellence, a prize won by the likes of Murakami, and this was for her first novel, Solo Dance, written in Japanese, her second language. Since then, she has been nominated for numerous prizes in Japan, and in 2021, she received the Minister of Education Award for Fine Arts, a prize for upcoming writers, as well as the Akutagawa Prize, the most prestigious literary prize in Japan. Solo Dance just came out a few days ago in the US, and so we're excited to see that, and also The Color of the Sky may be in line for some prizes this year. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to today's moderator, Willow Heath from Books and Bow.
Thank you, Karen. Hi. Okay, so yes, my name is Will, and I am from the blog and YouTube channel Books and Bow. And today, the way things will work is that I have a series of questions that I'm going to be asking Takami and Arthur. I have 5 questions, 3 for both, 1 for each. So 5 questions. After that, everyone in the audience is welcome to ask their own questions. If you want to drop any questions that you have into the chat as we go through, please do. But I believe we have the option at the end, if you want to come up on screen and vocalize your questions, you are free to do that. But otherwise, as we're going through, you have a question, pops into your head, type it into the chat. When things are done, I will go through the chat and I will read out your questions or allow you to read them out if you want to. Okay, so what we will do first before we get to the questions is we are going to have some introductions and some readings. Takami and Arthur have each prepared a reading from their novels, The Color of the Sky is the Shape of the Heart and Solo Dance. Okay, so Takami, do you want to go first with introducing the novel and giving us a reading from Chesil's book?
Sure, thank you. So just to give a little bit of background, the novel is about a 17-year-old Korean-Japanese teen, and though the book doesn't ever explicitly use this term, she's what many people would call a Zainichi Korean, which is an ethnic Korean person born and living in Japan. And as you'll discover from reading the book, is that growing up in Japanese society as a Zainichi Korean isn't always easy. And we find Ginny Park at the beginning of the novel. It's 2003, and she is staying with her host mother in Oregon. And she is a children's story writer. Stephanie is a children's story writer. And Ginny's bounced around from Japan to Hawaii to Oregon and really hasn't made any effort to sort of fit in. And so she's on the verge of flunking out of her high school. One day she's kind of like puttering around the house and discovers a scrap of paper, one of many scraps of paper that Stephanie kind of tosses away as she's writing her stories. And this particular scrap of paper basically reads, "The sky is falling, where do you go?" And so this sort of question sets Ginny off on a road trip all by herself to go find the answer to that question, and also at the same time to find herself. So that's kind of like the inciting incident. And then we kind of go back in time. It's 1998, and Ginny is now a 13-year-old in a North Korean school in Tokyo. And as she's on a road trip, she kind of begins to write down and take account of what happened in her past in Tokyo. And as we see her journaling, we begin to learn why she's been trying to sort of run away from confronting her past in Japan. And so the excerpt that I'm going to read, hopefully it won't be too long, is really about is a conversation between Stephanie and Ginny, where Stephanie is just kind of gently coaxing her to kind of open up about what happened to her in Tokyo. So this is Ginny. In Japan, there are two kinds of schools where Japan-born Koreans like me can go. I began, tracing my shoelaces with a finger. You can go to a Japanese school, of course, and there are Korean schools, South Korean and North Korean. I used to go to a North Korean school. The one South Korean school in Tokyo mostly had Korean-born students and hardly any Japan-born Koreans going there. But the North Korean schools are where the Japan-born kids with North Korean domicile status or South Korean citizenship went. I know it's confusing. Are you following so far? A tiny crease formed between Stephanie's brows. Yes, I think so. There's so much that happened. I mean, really, I said. I took down the portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il hanging in the classroom, smashed them to pieces and threw them off the balcony. Stephanie's breath caught in surprise. I've never told anyone the whole story. They told me I shouldn't. Even if they didn't, I don't think I could. Why is that? What I did was wrong. Ginny, I'm sure I don't understand everything, but if what you say is true, then you must tell someone about it someday. Even if that someone isn't me, you must tell someone. Could Stephanie be right? I looked up at the sky, pensive. Suddenly I remembered, the sky is about to fall. Stephanie looked up at the sky. She appeared to be looking at neither the stars nor into the darkness. Her eyes seemed to be fixed on something much farther. The sky, about to fall? What a funny thing to say. She smiled knowingly. But if the sky really did start to fall, where would you go? I asked. This is the sky you're talking about. There's no escaping it. If the sky should ever fall, you must accept it and catch its fall. You mustn't run away, Stephanie said, as though the answer were obvious. Stephanie's answer was a letdown. How is anything going to change by catching the sky's fall? The only sure thing to happen was that you were going to get crushed and die. On the other hand, maybe Stephanie was right. Back when it felt as if the sky was falling, maybe I should have accepted it. Maybe I should have caught its fall. Thanks.
That was incredible. Thank you very, very much, Takami. If anyone watching this hasn't read The Color of the Sky is the Shape of the Heart yet, please pick up a copy. I read it a few weeks ago, and I was in a forest while I was reading it, and I took a photo of it, and then I fell over. So that's my story. It's an incredible book that really opens your eyes to the experiences, the history, the culture, the circumstances of Zainichi Koreans in Japan. And we need more literature like it. Honestly, it is a very underexposed culture within Japan. And I think it's something that's very, very necessary. And I'm very, very grateful to you for translating it and bringing it to us, because now we have the opportunity to read something that needs more exposure. And I think that's what kind of unites the two books that we're talking about. They are both books about experiences that are underexposed. And that's what's really cool. So both of these translators are bringing us books that are unique in terms of experience. And that brings us to Solo Dance. So Arthur has translated Solo Dance by Lee Kotomi. And this is Arthur's debut translation, and he's done an absolutely incredible job. Arthur, do you want me to do an introduction to the novel, or do you want to?
I will be brave and learn from Takami's example and introduce it myself. Solo Dance is Ali Kotomi's debut novel. It won the same prize that Chesil's The Color of the Sky is Shaped with the Heart won, the Gunzo New Writers Prize. It was written in 2017 and published in 2018, so a relatively recent book. And it follows a Taiwanese woman who goes by many different names throughout the novel. Her birth name is Jiao Yingmei. She renames herself Jiao Jihui, which pronounced in Japanese is Cho Norie, which is the name we've been using, the publication, the kind of publicity of the book. It, like Lee Kotomi, Cho Norie is born in Taiwan and moves to Japan. However, unlike Lee Kotomi, Cho's move is prompted by a violent sexual assault that she experiences just before she goes to university in Taipei. And following that, she experiences a lot of problems with her mental health and essentially flees from Taiwan to try and build a new life, but realizes that that isn't as easy as it should be. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from relatively near the beginning of the book, where Cho and her friends are going to a club in Nichome, which is a gay district within Tokyo. It was a blustery Saturday in February, 1 month after her 27th birthday, and she was heading towards a lesbian club night in Omotesando. To dull her pain, she longed for deafening music, booze, and a space where she could dance as wildly as she wanted. Shaw was with her, along with Sophia, a Taiwanese woman, Aki, who was Japanese. Of course, both of these names were their online usernames. At 11:30, there were few cars on the road, and most people were heading to the station, yet the club still had a large queue snaking out from the entrance. The queue was moving, but slowly. After half an hour, they still couldn't see the entrance. 30 minutes in the biting cold was starting to take its toll, and their hand warmers had lost all but residual heat. As the four of them jogged on the spot for warmth, she pointed over at the nearby Family Mart. "How about I buy something for us while we wait," she suggested, receiving orders of hot coffee, hot cocoa, and extra hand warmers. She left the crowd and crossed the street to the convenience store. The array of items in her arms, she was about to head for the till when a familiar voice called from behind. "Is that you, Norie?" She spun round. It was Erika and Okabe. She couldn't process seeing Erika here of all places, let alone with Okabe. She glanced down at their hands clasped together, worked out the situation on the spot. "Hey, Erika, what a coincidence. What are you doing here?" "Hello, Okabe," she said, keeping her expression calm. She and Okabe were in the same division, and although Erika was in a different one, they all belonged to the same department and so worked on the same floor. She had seen them talking a number of times, so it wasn't too much of a surprise for them to be together now. "Takeshi and I were just out for dinner," Erika said, the color rushing to her cheeks. She realized her mistake a moment later. She had used Okabe's first name. Erika corrected herself, appearing more awkward than before. "I mean, Okabe, of course. So what about you, Norie? What are you doing here this late? Do you live nearby?" "No way. I'm way too poor to live around Omotesando. Some friends from Taiwan invited me out drinking nearby. It's looking to be an all-nighter, so I thought I'd grab some supplies," she said, somewhere between the truth and a lie. "Wow, that's amazing. You're so international," Erika said. She puzzled at Erika's words. What was international about her going drinking with someone else from Taiwan? And why was Erika using the word international as if it were meant to be some kind of compliment?
Excellent. Thank you, Arthur. That was really, really, really cool. Both of these books are amazing, and I am thrilled that we get to talk about them. And again, if anyone watching this has not checked out both of these books, please, please do. At Books and Bow, we began by championing and trying to promote literature and translation, mostly from East Asia, and then it kind of grew. But as time has gone on, we've also tried to promote a lot of queer voices, queer authors. And that's what's really exciting about Solo Dance, is that it's a very intersectional book. Solo Dance is about migration. It's about moving from place to place, trying to make a new start, but it's also about queerness, and it's also about mental health, mental illness, and suicide. And Cho Norie is a very depressed woman. She is gay, and she is an immigrant to Japan. And so it's ticking a lot of boxes when it comes to representation and subcultures of people. So Solo Dance, I've said this many times, is one of my favorite novels, probably my favorite novel of this year so far. And Arthur did a really incredible job in translating it, and I am absolutely thrilled. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to move into 5 questions, as I said, that I have written, and I'm going to be asking both Arthur and Takami. And at the end, we will turn it over to everyone else who's watching. And again, as we're going through this, you think of a question, something you want to ask, throw it into the chat, and I will read it out. Okay, now on to the questions. These first 3 questions are for both Takami and Arthur. So let's just go, I will ask the question, and Takami, you answer first, and then Arthur, you give your answer. Let's do it that way. Question 1. What was it that initially drew you to your book and made you want to translate it?
Okay, so the book was nominated for the Akutagawa Prize, as you know, is one of the most prestigious literary awards in Japan, and it was nominated back in 2016. This actually the same period as Sayaka Murata's Convenience Store Woman. And among those nominees, this was the one that really stood out to me as one that I wanted to read. And when I did, I instantly fell in love with Ginny's story. I'm generally drawn to stories that sort of upend commonly held beliefs about Japan or complicate my own understanding of Japanese society, but especially of those that sort of highlight the experiences of populations that, Will, you mentioned that of populations that we don't often see highlighted. So that was really important to me. I'm also often drawn first to the prose, what the prose is doing, the particular voice or evocativeness of the narrative. And so with this book, I love Ginny's voice, which was just sort of, underneath. It was really sort of seething, bubbling with like this palpable anger, sense of indignation at the injustices that none of the adults and even her friends would confront, even though, as a child, she could plainly see that the way society works isn't right? It's wrong. So those are some of the things that drew me initially. The other thing that I really loved about this book is that the protagonist, Ginny, she's like this blossoming writer. And what we're reading are snatches or fragments of her journal entries. And that's why each of the chapters tend to be very short. They're kind of fragments of her memories as she's trying to kind of piece them together. And by putting them all together, we kind of make sense of what happened in her past. And I love that she uses writing as a way to kind of make sense of her past, because that's how I tend to, use writing to navigate the world myself. So those are some of the things that drew me to translating it.
Awesome. I have to say as well, you mentioned the voice, Ginny's voice, and it really is something that comes through in your translation, the idea that, as you said, the kind of bubbling anger beneath the surface. She is a young woman, she's very young, and she's gone through a lot, and there's this wonderful line that she's sort of like a balancing act that she's doing between sort of almost a childhood angst and a sort of righteous indignation. She understands that she has been wronged and she's been troubled, and as you said, as a budding writer, her expression is borderline youthful and poetic, and I think that is gorgeously expressed. So it's beautifully done. It really is. Okay, Arthur, over to you.
Before I answer the question, I just want to say that it's another interesting what's the word point of commonality between the two novels is that Chonori as well uses literature as a way to kind of process the world. There are a lot of, I'm kind of really not answering your question now. There are a lot of references to Chinese literature within the book because the main character uses that to frame her own worldview. And I think that's quite an interesting point in common between the two books, even if they are expressed that slightly differently. But to answer your question, I think as I'm half Japanese, but I grew up in the UK, so I'm kind of half an immigrant to Japan, kind of not linguistically. I view myself as an immigrant to the Japanese language, and to see just by perhaps due to Japan's immigration history, there are less non-Japanese native speakers writing in Japanese. And that really drew me to Kotomi's work in that, you know, she learned Japanese from, I think, the age of 14, and now has a blossoming literary career. And I dabbled myself in writing a bit in Japanese, and I thought, what kind of literature would this different perspective provide on a personal level, that is. And then when I read the book, before I translated it, I read all of the books she had out at the moment. I just realized how kind of dynamic her ideas were. Like I want all of her books to be published in English because of how many different areas they cover. After reading it, I was really interested in it, and I was lucky enough to meet Kotomi's agent, who recommended me to World Editions to translate the book. And that's the story of how the book came to be.
Awesome. That was wonderful. It is very, very interesting how much these two books overlap thematically. There is so much in these books that makes them feel like a perfect pairing. And that's what is so cool about this event, is that you can kind of peel back layers and layers of connection between these two novels. And it's almost weird. Right. Thank you both. That was very, very cool. You know, I keep saying that, and that's because I'm just having an awful lot of fun. Number two. Okay, so again, Takami, you can answer this first. Both of these books deal with similar themes, as I just said. These are themes of identity and belonging. Identity and belonging are very broad terms, and each of them tackles those things in different ways. But again, they overlap. So they both deal with these themes of identity and belonging. Was there anything about these topics that resonated with you personally or professionally?
Well, I mean, gosh, identity and belonging, those are just universal, major themes, aren't they? And Ginny, who is, again, Zainichi Korean, born and raised in Japan, her experience, her life is of in-betweenness. You know, isn't fully accepted at her Japanese school because she's Korean, and she isn't fully accepted at her North Korean school because she's not Korean enough. And that sense of in-betweenness is something that, you know, I'm certain, you know, bicultural, biracial kids, anybody can identify with. And as someone who has experienced that sense of in-betweenness, you know, kind of all my life, you know, sort of not fully belonging to American or Japanese culture, you know, I naturally gravitate towards those kinds of stories.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, it's a fascinating, the way that the world blends and the way that borders work and cultures overlap it's very easy for us to relate to concepts of identity and belonging. And for me as well, as a person, as a queer person who blossomed into queerness later in life, if you like, it resonates with me as well. And again, especially with Solo Dance, as that is also a queer novel. Okay, over to Arthur.
It wouldn't be good of me to just say what Takami said, would it? So it's a big question, isn't it? I think what I liked about Solo Dance is that it's a story about migration, but the kind of the things we kind of associate with migration, like, oh, do I fit in this culture? I'm learning this language. Am I speaking this language in a way that fits in with this culture? I think a lot of novels tackle that, and I think this one doesn't. And I think that really lends itself to focusing more on the characters on a more personal level. Obviously, we're all parts of our contexts, and this novel is like entrenched in all these contexts, but Lee doesn't go out of her way to try and like really like say, oh, because she moved, this is really important. She kind of like says, this is what happened, and we can see the kind of ripple-on effects and the contextual effects of that. And I think that's kind of a worldview that I probably prescribe myself to similarly. I think a lot of our relationships are very much one-on-one, or these kind of personal relationships. And I really enjoyed that aspect of the book, how Cho herself as an individual navigates through all these different spaces.
Brilliant. Really, really, really good answers. I also I like what you said. And you can't just repeat, obviously, what Takami said. And you said something very, very good. So that was awesome. Thank you, guys. I'll move straight into the third question, which is, were there any unexpected challenges? Now, this is a question that I think about quite a lot. And I don't always have the opportunity to ask translators this question because I don't meet and talk to every translator whenever I review or discuss a book in translation. So this is a great opportunity for me to ask, were there any unexpected challenges that you came up against while translating the book? Takami?
Yeah, I had to kind of think about this question. I mean, I think, you know, to some degree, every aspect of translating is a challenge. And yet that's precisely the reason why I and perhaps Arthur, like, we do this thing, because it's just so incredibly challenging, and that's the fun of it, right? That's the pleasure in it. And so rather than talking in terms of unexpected challenge, maybe I can kind of reframe the question to kind of think about like a challenge that I decided to take on for myself just a tiny bit more. And that was to push back on some established conventions of translating for like a US or English reader. And this is nothing new. I mean, other translators do this, but it was just something that I wanted to sort of put to myself with this particular novel. Oftentimes we're asked to bridge cultural gaps by inserting sort of sometimes long explanations of cultural references that English readers may not understand. Other times we may be asked to take out certain references that may seem sort of un-PC because it may raise a red flag for an English reader, but not necessarily for a reader of the source text, right? And we're asked to make those concessions and accommodations for this sort of like very sort of hazy, amorphous English reader. And sometimes that could be kind of a, I guess, a disservice to the source text and its author. And so, so I tried to kind of push back against some of those sort of conventions. I resisted adding a lot of cultural explanation, in part because the author didn't include very much. Chesil, the author, didn't give lengthy explanations about the legacy of, you know, Japanese oppression in Korea. That didn't talk about why Ginny's grandfather lives in North Korea separate from his family. Like all those things, all those explanations probably would have been helpful, but she didn't give them. And so oftentimes I think of like how great it would be if more English readers could get used to that idea that not everything is going to be explained, you know, to us, right? Or not everything's going to center their experiences and expectations. And that could be something obviously very beneficial. That's the pleasure of reading a translated, you know, translated literature. That's what translated literature has to offer. The writer, I feel like, especially with these two novels, has done this very generous thing of giving us access into their world. Which can be often very private and very personal. And so I hope as readers, we're kind of like willing to do some of the work on our own to sort of understand a culture or history that we're not familiar with, and kind of like expect that to be put upon us through the translation. So long story short, I decided to sort of resist it at adding a lot of that stuff. And I should say the editors were, to their credit, like very understanding and supporting of what I was trying to do.
Excellent, excellent. That is a very, very interesting point, because for anyone who hasn't yet read the novel, the acts, I guess you could call them, the acts are separated by these letters, and the letters come from Ginny's grandfather in North Korea over to his family, and they're very, very contextless. They come in as sort of interludes, and you don't at first even know who this person is really as you read the first letter. And the fact that no context, no explanation is given means that it's kind of up to you to do your own research. And if you think about it, we do this all the time with literature that's written in English. There are going to be books that you read from, I don't know, if you're American, a book that has been written in Australia, there are going to be words you don't know, language you don't understand. And we just Google these things without thinking about it. And so we shouldn't be scared to do exactly the same when it comes to books in translation. if you go into this book and you don't know what a Zainichi Korean is, you can do your research, and it's going to be very rewarding if you do that. So excellent, really good answer. Okay, over to you, Arthur.
Cool. Yeah, I'll probably head out on a more linguistic answer to the question. What I think my first question to myself was, when I read this book and set to the task of translating it, was it's narrated all in third person, but she. So as I mentioned earlier, the main character has multiple different names, and these names are only used within dialogue. So you'll only know her name when someone else calls her name. But within all of the narrative text, it's just she, which is something that works a bit more smoothly in Japanese because there's less of a reliance on using the subject in the sentence. Whereas in English, it's a very subject, very pronoun-heavy language. And I think that proved a bit of a challenge when translating it, especially when the main character is with her two female friends. And it's like, she, and you're like, who are we talking about here? So I had to do a bit of juggling to make it clear who was talking to who without kind of losing this, not anonymous, but this technique that Lee used to illustrate that her main character has all these different identities, but she is still herself, essentially. And I was going to, Takami's answer actually reminded me of something that I was doing when I was translating this book. Was there are a lot of quotations from Chinese literature, which to a Japanese reader are a bit more obvious if you studied classical Chinese or classical Japanese in school in Japan. Whereas if I were to translate these into English, even if you Googled them, it probably wouldn't come up, just because it's maybe these authors haven't been translated into English, or different translations exist. So something I chose to add in, just for, I think it benefited the author and the book, was to say the author of each quotation she says, so that if people were interested, they could go, oh, Du Fu, he's a famous Chinese poet. Or there are a few Japanese haiku authors as well that appear in this novel. And I think I tried to make it as smooth as I could without the characters going, oh, and this is by so-and-so. But I think that otherwise the references just wouldn't come across as nicely, I thought. So please read every author mentioned in this book, because they're all fantastic authors.
Awesome. Well, I haven't obviously read the original text, and so I can say as a reader that you did a fantastic job of making that, as you said, as smooth and streamlined as possible. And I think that that is also a really interesting point, especially bringing up the linguistic differences when you said about English being a pronoun-heavy language. And it reminded me of certain forms of fiction that play with those things, and like this isn't one of them in the English. And I think the way that you tackled it was absolutely brilliant. You guys have done such a wonderful job translating these texts. So go read them, people, if you haven't yet. What are you waiting for? Okay, so what I have here now are one question for each translator that are unique questions to them. And so I'm going to start with the question for Arthur first, because I wrote it first. And then we will move on to a specific question for Takami. Okay, so this question is just for Arthur, and this is related specifically to solo dance. Since the book deals with history and... Wait, no, that's Takami's question. How did I do that? Who knows? Were there any specific hurdles for you as a translator when it came to the tone, structure, queerness, or mental health aspects of the book, which are all big thematic points within this particular text?
Can I be boring and say no?
Absolutely.
I feel that all of these aspects, if you were to be someone who hadn't dealt with any of these aspects in your daily life, I feel they're so lucidly explained in the book. I think Lee Kotomi very candidly deals with all these subjects. She's not really scared of taboos and stuff. She writes what she feels, and I think that really aids people who might not be able to empathize. It might help them empathize a little bit more. I think the overall tone of the book, it's a very, I don't want to call it a bleak novel, because I personally don't think that it is, but it is. Anyway, it's not a particularly, I wouldn't say it's an extremely bleak novel, but I think some of the subject matter does get quite heavy at times.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, you're translating word by word sometimes. And then when you reread over the sentences and paragraphs you've done, you kind of realize again how heavy it is. And sometimes it's worth taking a step back from it, I think. When I was translating it, it was hard to like marathon it essentially, just because of the subject matter it dealt with. But yeah, I think Lee dealt with it in a very candid and not approachable, but a way that a lot of readers, would be able to empathize with.
I'm glad you said the word empathize at the end, actually, because for anyone who hasn't read it, I guess you could almost put a trigger warning for Solo Dance. It is bleak, but it is not only bleak. It is also a very hopeful book. And I think it's very grounded in that way, because life is bleak and life is also hopeful. And so I think as you read Solo Dance, it's one of the most empathetic books that I've ever come across. I read it only a few weeks ago, and I've been struggling with a bout of depression myself recently, which I talked about in my review. And it held my hand. Solo Dance truly held my hand through a lot of difficult thoughts and feelings and moments. And I think that in that sense, it is the most empathetic thing I've ever read. And if it's that empathetic, it can't be bleak, if that makes sense, because bleakness is very nihilistic and empathy is the complete opposite of that. And so I thought it was absolutely beautiful, but it is a tough read. There's no getting around that. It's tough, but it's certainly not out to hurt you as a reader at all. It is out to comfort you in a sense. And I'm very grateful to it for that. Okay, so now this question is for Takami, and I'm going to read out the right question. Since The Color of the Sky is the Shape of the Heart, so we're all saying that very quickly because it's a very long title. Since it deals with history and experiences specifically of Zainichi Koreans in Japan, did you have to do any research into the history, culture, and also the political rights of that community in Japan?
Not for this book. As I said earlier, there wasn't a lot that I had to explain, and that was explained in the book. But I'd also, 4 years ago, had translated another book by a Zainichi Korean author. It's called Go by Kazuki Kaneshiro. And so I got a lot of that sort of research and knowledge through the process of translating that. It's interesting that in that book, in Go, the author like purposefully wrote in like lots of explanation about the history of how the Korean population came to Japan during World War II, how they came to stay. And there's a lot of that just really cleverly done through exposition, through a story of the father. And so, and he did that, the author did that because he knew, this was published in 2000, that his Japanese readers were not going to know anything about it. And so he anticipated this, and so he worked that into the opening of that novel. And I'll be honest with you, that's how I kind of started. That was my entry into learning about the Zainichi population, and then there you go, and then off you go, and you do and research your own thing. Whereas for Chesil, I don't know, like, so this was published in 2016, so 16 years after Kazuki Kaneshiro's Go. And she gave almost no explanation about that sort of background of that population, assuming perhaps that maybe enough people would know about it in the year 2016. And also there's just as an invitation for the readers to do more research, themselves. Oh, and by the way, if you want to read more about the Zainichi Korean community in Japan, there's lots of great literature. more needs to be translated, but certainly I recommend reading Go. I would also recommend reading this anthology called Into the Light. And it's an anthology of literature of Korean writers in Japan. And that book also has a really good introduction into the history of Koreans and Zainichi literature in general. So 2 recommendations for you.
Excellent. Can you say that again? Was that Into the Light?
Into the Light. Yeah,
okay.
It's an anthology. I can't remember what the subtitle is, but it's an anthology.
Excellent.
Yeah, I need to read that, I think.
Does it have quite a few different writers in it?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Umiti's in there, I think, and I can't remember off the top of my head who the others are, but I recall that Umiti is in there as well.
Excellent, good. For anyone who might recognize that name, Yumi wrote Tokyo Ueno Station, which was translated by Morgan Giles and is a absolutely spellbinding little novel. My God, it's good. It's real good. I love that book so much. Before we turn it over to the audience for questions, Takami and Arthur also have questions that they wanted to ask each other. Are you guys still okay to do that?
Yeah. Arthur.
Should I go first, or would you like to go first?
Go on.
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to ask how it felt navigating Korean as a 3rd language in the space of the novel. I felt that was another kind of point in common that the 2 novels have. So in Solo Dance, there is a there's the Chinese language that some of her friends speak. She writes a poem herself in the book, which I asked our editors to keep in the English edition. And I wanted to ask what did you think about the kind of power hierarchy between 3 languages we're dealing with? We have, it's written in Japanese. In the Japanese text, there is another language, and then we're transposing both of those back into English. So I wonder how you viewed the relationship of those 2 languages when.
I understand what you're saying. In my case, this particular book or Go didn't use a lot of Korean words in the narrative. And so I didn't have to worry about negotiating Korean as a 3rd language as much as you probably did with the Chinese. Ginny's a character whose native language is Japanese. And one of her barriers is that she doesn't know very much Korean, which is a barrier for her to fit in at her North Korean school. So what I did was I chose to, again, did we lose Arthur?
Yeah.
Oh.
So Arthur's currently in the French Alps, which is why his connection's been a bit rough. Hopefully he'll be back soon. He did say that he would connect to his phone's internet if things get particularly bad, but you can obviously keep going.
Okay, I'll just, hopefully he'll be back. he'll have heard none of this, but here he comes. So anyway.
Sorry, guys.
That's all right. I'm glad you're back. I was saying that it didn't figure all that heavily. Ginny's a character whose native language is in Japanese. She doesn't know a lot of Korean, which is kind of a barrier, right, for her to fit in at her North Korean school. So one thing that I did, and I don't know if this kind of answers your question, one thing that I did was that I chose to italicize the certain Korean words that were foreign to Ginny in the narrative, but opted not to foreignize or italicize anything else. So you mentioned something about that word nugu. That figures into one chapter of this book. Nugu, which means different things in Japanese and Korean, and this confusion kind of causes an embarrassing moment for her. But most of the other words, if they weren't familiar to Ginny and not foreign to her, I didn't italicize any of the Korean words, any of the Japanese words in the narrative. And so I guess to an English reader, they probably would have no idea which are which are Japanese. Yeah. So in some ways that eliminates the power hierarchy that you were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a good solution. Yeah, kind of framing it from our protagonists' point of view.
So, but you had to deal a lot more directly with the presence of both languages in the text. So I'm just wondering how you navigated that.
Yeah, it was quite interesting because there were a few bits of dialogue between Cho and some of her friends from Taiwan, but only a few very specific ones, which unfortunately I had to just, I kept as English because I didn't want to make these, you know, I think there were probably about 4 over the course of the novel, just stand out for unnecessarily. Yeah. An unwieldy solution, but a solution nonetheless.
Awesome. Okay, so that was Arthur's question. I'm losing track now. And then Takami, you also have a question for Arthur.
Yeah. Are you game, Arthur?
Yeah. Anytime.
So I want.
If I cut out again, yeah, then it's not because I'm running away.
So both of our writers, they're kind of writing from the margins. Both authors like really bravely tackle subjects that might be considered taboo, especially in Japan.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to focus a little bit about how both authors depicted mental illness. And I was wondering if we could just, I don't have a question. I was wondering if we could each talk a little bit about that, I guess.
Yeah. I think structurally, for people who haven't read this book yet, it's divided between the present day and Cho Norie's past. So chapter 1 is present day, chapter 2 is her past, and so on and so on and so on. And it reaches about the halfway point through the novel, where she finally decides to seek help from a psychiatrist at her university. And that kind of begins part 2 of the book, which is a lot of diary entries. So I think that, like I said earlier, I think Lee Kotomi really deals with it in a very kind of candid and frank way, and is, yeah, like Willow said, the aspect of hope. It's saying that although things do get worse for her after that point, it's saying that, you know, mental health is important. It was a real turning point for her life. And I think, yeah, it's often a very taboo thing in Japanese in Japanese society. And I think that it was a very brave thing to do for one's debut novel to, you know, have a character who has mental health problems and to, push seeking help when you need help, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I just found it so refreshing that Cho Norie, even kind of willingly, like even in her introduction, she was considering working that into part of her introduction, I think at the beginning of the, of the novel. And she's very, as you said, open and candid about like naming it, right? Naming that I have a mental health issue, which is completely opposite from the way Chesil kind of handles it. She doesn't name it at all.
Yeah.
And we just find the main character, Ginny, without kind of giving away what happened, but some things happen and she ends up in a psychiatric facility at one point. And, but she never talks about what it is, where she is. And she talks about this facility as like very sort of murky, as these spaces that exist everywhere in the world, but we don't really notice them until we've actually stepped foot inside of one. And here, I think she's really talking about like just institutions in general, institutions like prison, psychiatric facilities that, lock up people who are deemed even remotely sort of deviating from the norm, right? They exist to make these problematic people disappear from view, right? And I just found that really just stunning, the way she didn't name it, and just the counterpoint of how Lee Kotomi kind of names it and is quite open and honest about it.
I think they're fighting against it in their different ways and what they both individually need, which I think also is quite important.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
It's also, there's what you two kind of alluded to as well, was trauma. There is an aspect of trauma in both of these books, but without spoiling anything, again, both protagonists go through a specific traumatic incident in the books. In the case of Solo Dance, it is a traumatic incident that is alluded to in the blurb, so we know about it, but we don't actually see it until later on. And it's the same with The Color of the Sky. Is there's a traumatic incident later on in the book, and yet they both explore that in different ways. One of them, I would say, with The Color of the Sky, the traumatic incident makes you sympathize and feel sad, but because it's a book about a very specific experience of a very specific person representing a specific subculture, if you like, of people. I don't know if that's the right word, but a culture within Japan. Whereas Solo Dance, it's a traumatic incident that arguably is more universally relatable because it is it's sexual abuse, and they both present trauma in different ways. One feels more universal, the other feels more personal, and yet I don't know, it's fascinating, the concept of abuse being something that is personal and universal. And you, as a reader, I don't know, I argue, you feel similarly and differently. I don't know. I'm having a conversation with myself over this. You guys can kind of ignore me. I think I'll carry on by myself thinking about how to present trauma, because I'm working on something in my head right now, so just ignore me. What we'll do now, after I just did that, we're going to turn it over to audience questions. We have a few that I've been trying to keep track of.
I think there's a few in the chat and a few in the Q&A.
Yeah, there is a Q&A section, and I've got the chat open right now, so we'll do the chat first. So I've got 2 questions here from the chat, which I will read out, and you guys can decide who's going to answer. And yeah, that's your thing. So the first question comes from H. Kim, and the question is, people say that there is no such thing as perfect translation. What do you think gets lost in the process of translation? This is such a big, interesting question. And do you think there's anything gained during the act of translation? Really good question.
I have something to say, so I will say what I want to say. I'm not sure if it cut out before I showed the this Chinese poem here.
Yeah, we saw.
I think so. Lee Kotomi, as mentioned in her introduction, is a bilingual writer and translator. So she translated this novel herself into Chinese. And in the original Japanese, there is the traditional Chinese poem and a Japanese translation underneath it. And when she translated the book into Chinese, obviously she didn't need the translation underneath that section. But in the English version, in a way, the English version is emulating the Japanese original of the book more than the Chinese version of the book, by grace of it being a bilingual kind of book anyway. And I think that, I think that kind of expresses how there are so many different aspects of translation that are gained and lost. And I think it's just more interesting to celebrate, the stuff that's gained rather than what we lose, because we're always losing stuff when we're talking to people, I think. Just by nature of
That's such a beautiful answer. I like that. Let's look at the positive. And I mean, yeah, because translation is an act of love and expression and sharing, which is cool. Takami, do you have anything to add?
I'm really appreciative of the question that they asked both questions, like what's lost, but also considering what's been gained. I can't tell you very specifically about, I mean, certain things have been lost, but I'm not quite sure what those are. But I can tell you very specific things about what's been gained in the translation. With this particular novel, I had a chance to work pretty closely with the author, Chesil. And she was wonderful in that she understood that a translation is not an exact copy of what she has written. She was very willing to kind of let it become its own thing. And so if I'd asked her something, she would sometimes add a sentence or two and say, hey, just put that in there. And so she was actually like I was co-creating with her. Like she was actually writing more things, not a lot, just like a sentence or two. But in the translation process. So it's very much, there is something being gained there. Arthur, you talked a little bit about how gender pronouns are usually non-existent, or you don't have to use them when you're in Japanese, but you almost always have to use them in English. And so that was a challenge, and that was an opportunity where I felt like I had to ascribe a certain gender to two things: the sky and the star. And I asked Chesil, like, well, should we play around with that a little bit? Maybe there's a little bit of an opportunity by gendering them in a certain way that we can reinforce a specific theme that you are, trying to get across in your novel. And so the first suggestion, she said yes, and then the second suggestion, she said no. And so we just kind of played around with that. And I just really love that whole collaborative process that I had, because we don't usually, we don't get that. We seldom get that. And so, yeah, there were some things that I felt were gained in the translation.
Yeah, I got an opportunity to ask Lee a few questions too. The least interesting one was, there's a character called Dr. Chen, and I had to ask if Dr. Chen was a man or a woman. So I think that's not as exciting as the stars and the sky, but important nonetheless.
That is absolutely fascinating. Also, I love that little insight that we've just gotten into the fact that there was a sense of co-creation. That's really, really interesting. So Daniel Hahn, who is also an incredible translator, has asked us a question here, which is the flip side of my question. What came easily in your translation? We talk about the challenges of translation a lot, but sometimes things surprise you the other way and come very, very easily and naturally. I bet for all the struggles that there were a few aspects that just flew. Either of you want to tackle that?
Yeah, Danny, nothing comes easily for me. Everything is gut-wrenching, and it doesn't come easily. And so, yeah, I felt like everything was a challenge. Whereas translating Go was quite a different experience, because I understood that voice. It was very close to mine. And so that one flew. This one, the prose was a little bit more spare. It was about like sort of paring down and create really these simple, clean lines. And that doesn't come easily for me. And so I worked at those sentences quite a bit. I don't know. But anyway, that's the pleasure of it. So I'm okay with that.
I think personally, when the novel switches to the first person diary entries, that was a real kind of breath of fresh air to finally have some, I guess, closeness to the narrator at that point, because of just how distant, I feel in a way the third person narration is quite distant, and I didn't want to kind of get too intimate, I suppose, with that. So when it was, first person, she's talking about herself very directly, I was like, oh, thank God, I can use the word I. I haven't been used the word I for the whole book. So yeah, I think that I liked the balance there, personally.
Awesome. Okay, we have 2.5, if you like, questions left. I know we're running over time, but I'm going to read them out anyway. So this next question comes from Angelo Wong, who asked Arthur a very specific question about names. Lee Kotomi is the transliteration of the author's Japanese name, but there was also the option to transliterate her name by its Chinese reading, Li Qinfeng. Since you talked about how to transliterate Cho Norie's name, I'm curious to hear how you decided on translating the author's name.
Very, very good question. However, that was something that was decided before I was involved in the translation process. I think Lee's agent, I assume they would have discussed it together. But on top of that, on the Japanese version of the novel, it's got her name in Roman letters, Lee Kotomi, on the front. So I think that is her own personal way of expressing herself when she's writing in Japanese, I think. When she's expressing that Japanese language side of her. I think she does use Li Qingfeng on her website, but I think that's when she wishes to express the Chinese language aspect of her.
Brilliant. Very interesting. Okay, and we also have two quick questions from Naomi. Arthur, this is a stupid question. Is this our friend Naomi?
Yes, it is. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, excellent. I wasn't entirely sure because I completely forgot her last name. So it's your last name. Excellent. Good. So Naomi asked, thanks very much for a great talk. And a question for both of you is, as translators who know these two novels very closely, if readers are taking away one message from each of these novels, what do you think that should be? Great question.
Do you want to go first, Takami, or should I go first?
Go on, go please.
Okay. I think it's something that we've touched on during this talk already. I think, yeah, hope, really. Life can be hard. Life can be very unfair. Life is full of things that we personally can't control. Everything in this book that happens is literally out of her control. And one of the points near the end of the book is the main character having to, or not having to, but realizing that some things are out of our control, but we still live on. And yeah, I think just hope, really. Life can be dark and difficult, but there are people out there who care for us, and we should hold on to that.
Excellent. Excellent.
I think, well, I mean, I think you can make a message, you can find a message that's highly interpretable. So, I mean, you can find many messages in there, but I think it was clear to me the emotions and purpose behind why Chesil wrote the book. And part of it was that I think she wanted to really call out adults, like grown-ups, in part for creating this like really, sorry, but effed up world, which is divided and tribal in ways that can be really dangerous for girls like Ginny, right? Just because she is Korean, just because she wears the chimachogori, the hanbok, which is like the traditional school uniform that schoolgirls in Kugoro North Koreans wear, Korean schools wear. And that puts her in some sort of peril. And so I feel like, this book is marketed as a YA book, but it is just as much meant to be read by parents, by older readers, because I think ultimately that's who Chesil is trying to kind of reach and sort of call out, if you will. Yeah.
That is a very, very interesting point about the book. That is actually something I hadn't considered. It's very, very interesting, the point about targeting adults, if you like. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that answer. Naomi also asked a very quick question, which could be a lovely way to end this, actually, is for both of you.
I think we have another question, but if we don't have time for it, I suppose we don't have time.
Oh, so we do. Okay. We'll see. Karen can jump in the chat and let me know if we have time for one more. So Naomi's quick second question was, what are you both currently reading, or do you have any recommendations that you just want to throw out to people?
I would recommend Notes of a Crocodile by Chu Miao-chin, that gets referenced in this book. It's an amazing book. It's translated by an amazing translator, Bonnie Hui, and I think it will deepen your love of this book, and it's a great book anyway. So please read it.
I am absolutely drawing a blank, but hopefully those other recommendations that I made earlier kind of help. Read Go, read Into the Light, read Morgan Giles's excellent translation of Tokyo Winter Station. Those are really great places to start.
Excellent, absolutely, and I thoroughly agree. Okay, since we have one more question, let's answer it, and then we will stop there after this. So Sebastian has asked, and this is a question for Takami, is about the translating strategy. Not explaining much. Sorry, I'm just trying to read it. I haven't read it yet, so I'm reading it out. I'll just read the whole thing out. I hope my question won't come across rudely, but I have a question for Ms. Takami Nieda about the translating strategy with not explaining much and forcing the reader to search for information for themselves, which I think is a really good idea. However, with a theme about Koreans and Japanese, sometimes from a Japanese perspective, we can find people put as high as professors are denying some of the history. So like topics of comfort women, for example. Without explaining a little bit more about Zainichi Koreans, doesn't it give the possibility for people to find unintentionally one of these Japanese apologetic narratives? That's a very interesting question. Or maybe is there not particularly about this topic? That's an interesting question. Takami, what do you think about that?
I mean, that's a really great point that they're making. Yeah, but I think that's the peril of going online and Googling stuff, right? Regardless of what the topic is, you're going to find all sorts of narratives and denialists and sort of revisionists about a lot of topics. But you're right. I mean, particularly with the topic of comfort women. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this particular novel didn't engage that topic. And didn't engage a lot with the history. I think she just wanted to tell a simple story of a little girl. And so I think she kind of did away with a lot of that. So, you know, obviously I'm not going to insert comfort women if it's not in the novel. So, but I understand what you're saying. I absolutely do. That I think that's up to the information literacy of the reader. But thank you for that question.
Yeah, very, 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 very good point. I actually have a book recommendation because we've mentioned comfort women for the first time. There's a fantastic graphic novel by a Korean writer called Kumsuk Gendry Kim. I'll put it in the chat. And it's a graphic novel just called Grass. I think it was translated by Janet Hong. I'm not 100%, but I think it was translated by Janet Hong. But yeah, Grass is a wonderful graphic novel about comfort women from a very intimate perspective. So if you want to learn more about comfort women, I really do recommend reading Grass. Okay, we will leave it there. Karen, obviously you're hosting this and I know you're around. Is there anything you wanted to end on? Is there anything you wanted to say at the end? Feel free to jump back in. Is Karen here? I mean, if not, I will end this, which I had not planned on doing. And I just want to say, you're both great. Oh my God, I'm the host now. Oh my God, I feel like I've taken over time. Okay, so mutiny on the translation ship. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sticking around past scheduled end time as well.
Yeah, we really appreciate that. But this has been an incredible conversation, and just speaking as a reader, because like I was brought on to do this, and it's awesome. But I'm also just a person who reads your books and loves them. Thank you both so much. You've done incredible work, and I'm really grateful to both of you for both of these books. So, translation's a beautiful, wonderful thing, and you're beautiful, wonderful people. So, on behalf of everyone, thank you.
Thank you for your lovely hosting.
Thanks, Ben.
Yes, thank you.
All right, I will hopefully just click the end button, and that will be a thing that is fine to do. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, guys.
I wanted to delete everything. Okay, we'll find out. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye.